Hello, everybody. Welcome to our October live stream. I'm Jax James, Executive Director for Texas NORML. Today, I am joined by the lovely Susan Hayes, who is a cannabis lawyer and lobbyist. And what we're going to cover today, firstly, with Susan, is going to be the recent Delta 8 ruling, as well as some raids that have been going on. And then once we've covered that, we're going to jump over to some potential special session action, as well as some federal updates for you. So if you have questions while you are listening to any of these updates, please drop them in the comments. Also, we're interested where you're watching from. So you can also comment what city you're watching from if you would like. So I am going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Susan. Tell us about this ruling.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit and why Jax maybe asked me to comment on this. And it's because my background is I'm an appellate lawyer. I'm board certified in civil appellate law. Also am certified in legislative and campaign law. And I'm going to, if y'all will bear with me, do a little nerdy appellate procedure for you because it's important to understanding what this case means or this decision means. This case, the Delta 8 case brought by Sky Marketing, began as a case seeking an injunction against the law going into effect. Dishes threw up on its website, literally and metaphorically, that it considered Delta 8 a Schedule 1 substance and illegal. And also took some actions as to the administrative schedules, as I call them, of the schedules of drugs. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. So when you file an injunction, you kind of rush into court and get what's called a TRO, which you can get immediately, but it's only good for 14 days. Then you go for a temporary injunction. And if you can get that, you come back and do a full-blown trial and do a permanent injunction. And what happens in cases like this, when people are challenging laws, whether it's about cannabis or abortion or voting or whatever else, is you can appeal that temporary injunction order. So you end up having a case kind of go along on two tracks at once. First, your temporary injunction happens and it can get appealed. And then your case keeps trotting along and it goes to permanent injunction. And that too can be appealed. But the standard is different. In a temporary injunction appeal, we're not really talking about the full merits of the issue. Is Delta 8 cool or legal or not? We're really talking about, do the plaintiffs put enough of a showing that they probably can win in the long run? So that's the piece that got appealed here that the Austin Court of Appeals ruled on. It was an appeal from a temporary injunction. The plaintiffs won pretty much everything. And that means that the injunction that keeps the state from enforcing against Delta 8 remains in place. And the market can keep getting just further and further ahead of the state regulators who can't seem to get their act together. And kind of the core issues that got litigated in the appeal, again, weren't about the merits, it was about the process. Because what Dishes did is, instead of following their own rules about how they make rules, they just did it. They just used power without following rules. And that led to a claim called ultra vires, which is fancy Latin for it's beyond your powers. So they literally put up on their website, we consider Delta 8 Schedule 1. Well, they can't do that, is what the court said. They have to follow a process, and that process is in what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA. And state and federal governments have basically the same law. Before an agency can make a rule, they have to publish the proposed rule, and it's a process called notice and opportunity for comment. They have to give notice, hey, we're thinking about doing this, and give the public opportunity to comment about that. And they're supposed to seriously listen to the public's comments, incorporate them into their decision making, and then publish a final rule. That's what Dishes failed to do, and that's what they really just got their hands slapped by the Austin Court of Appeals on. Now, what does this mean going forward? Well, the state of Texas, presumably, is going to appeal to the Texas Supreme Court. They have 45 days to do that from the decision, which was the last week of September, till about mid-November. They also can ask the Supreme Court of Texas in a motion for, it's called emergency relief, to undo that injunction pending the appeal to the Texas Supreme Court. Now, kind of the problem and why the odds are in the favor of Delta 8 is they already did that when the trial court ruled against them, and the Austin Court of Appeals put the injunction back in place. And the Texas Supreme Court didn't bite. They said no. So what are the odds the court's going to do it now? Much lower. But we'll find out. Theoretically, the Texas Supreme Court could yank that injunction in the next month or so, or they could just leave the status quo as it is and let this appeal continue on. So meanwhile, folks who are out there selling Delta 8 have some legal cover to not be in trouble if the local constabulary decides it's a bad thing and wants to raid you. And that kind of brings me to the second topic I wanted to touch on, because we've really seen an uptick in raids around the state. There was a well-publicized one out of Southwest Houston about a month ago. And that one is really, as I've learned more about the facts and what happened, and I'll call it an outlying data point. It was not a nice, warm, cozy mom and pop CBD shop that got raided. It looked like, I mean, these people spent money. The outside of it was, designed. It looked like a chain dispensary like you'd see in a legal state. Spent some money tricking out their space. But they didn't even bother registering with dishes as a hemp retailer. And they didn't even bother getting a certificate of occupancy from the city of Houston. They were just absolutely 100% operating illegally. They had, from the products you could see in the media coverage, a whole lot of stuff that looked like it was brought in from California or Oklahoma. This edibles that are trademark infringing and look a lot like candy. That's a bad move if you don't want to call attention to yourself. And they had a whole bunch of what people are now calling THCA flower, which to DPS and to law enforcement is just weed. And that's how they're going to treat it. So that case, I think, probably goes forward. We'll see what the Harris County DA's office does. Seeing some more raids in the DFW area. I am super curious to learn how these raids play out and what the circumstances of each one. It feels like the DPS is starting to crack down and do it in a systematic way. But we'll see how that plays out and how it plays out with each individual district attorney's office. And that question gets more interesting. And as many of y'all may not have heard of, but last session, the legislature passed a law. They pushed it as we need to go after, quote, rogue DAs. And historically, and in our traditions in the United States, and I think even in England, prosecutors have a lot of discretion. They can pick what crimes to go after. That's what we elect them for. So they reflect the values of their local community. Well, the legislature doesn't like that the big urban counties are largely run by Democrats. So they passed a bill to go after, quote, rogue DAs. And then if the DA isn't, quote unquote, enforcing the law, they can be removed from office. So we're seeing these urban counties like Bexar, Travis, Nueces, Harris, Dallas have all said they would not prosecute low-level marijuana possession. The people were backing up from that, because if they make a pronouncement of a flat-out policy, I will not prosecute, they're opening themselves up to being removed from office. There's already been a suit filed in Hays County against a brand new DA there, although I think it may have already been dropped. Nueces County, that DA has announced he is going to run for the U.S. Senate, which kind of takes the wind out of the sails of the lawsuit to remove him. So that pressure that the DAs are under is absolutely going to affect the cannabis market in Texas and what local governments do when these raids come up, depending on the products people are selling. So that's my update. Happy to take any questions people have. Anything else Jax wants me to cover?
So curious as to, are there any next steps with this Delta 8 case, or is this just kind of dependent on the Supreme Court of Texas and what they want to do?
The ball's in the AG's court,
Okay.
and that's a really messy court right now. So many of you may have noticed.
Yeah.
Ken Paxton is back in office because the Senate didn't have the cojones to convict him. And what his office decides to focus on could be pretty rando. This case, though, is already in their hopper. So there are absolutely discussions going on internally at the AG's office. Do they continue to appeal it? And I think they will. And they can, like I said, file a motion to the Supreme Court asking them to quickly undo that injunction pending the appellate process. but I think that's very unlikely the Supreme Court does it. They've already said no once. So then we're looking at, I don't know, a year, maybe 18 months before the Supreme Court rules. And meanwhile, the injunction stays in place. So that gets us pretty much to next legislative session.
Where Delta 8 will still be available and legal to sell,
Yep.
but unfortunately that could change if the AG wants to take action, or next legislative session if they're able to push through one of their Delta 8 bans like they've been looking at in the previous 2 sessions.
Absolutely. Or if the governor adds that issue to the call of any of these special sessions that are upcoming.
Okay, awesome. I'm actually going to get to the special session next. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Susan. I appreciate you taking the time to give us a rundown on what's going on in Delta 8 land.
Anytime. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Bye. All right, guys. Susan's awesome. So glad she could join us tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit about the special session. As Susan was mentioning, there is this possibility afoot. So a special session will start on October 9th to address the border and school choice. The governor is the only person who can add topics whenever he calls a special session. So he sets the agenda. Recent coverage has some quotes from Representative Stephanie Click, who is the original author of the medical program that we have, and also has continued to author every bill that has expanded the program. And Representative Click was discussing the possibility of adding both medical cannabis and Delta 8 products to the special session. I'm going to read a couple of her quotes. So this is from Stephanie Click, representative in the Fort Worth area. She says, quote, "I think there could be things added. You know, when the governor vetoed some bills back during the regular session, he said that he would entertain further discussion in a special session in the future once property tax form legislation was passed." Unquote, end quote. Whatever. Representative Click does chair the House Public Health Committee. In her estimation, there is a crisis involving medical marijuana and should be added to the call. And she wants to also discuss those Delta 8 products. She says, quote, "We know that there has been an increase in calls to poison control centers with children that are getting access to hemp-based products. These are unregulated." No, it's not 100% true. Many of the products are not even tested. Click also wants to expand the rules for the compassionate use program for medical conditions that don't qualify with a prescription. She says, quote, "There are folks that are going to the unregulated market and unregulated products because they have conditions that may not be currently approved on the list of conditions to participate in the compassionate use program." So there is a possibility that both Delta 8 and medical cannabis could be added to the special session starting on October 9th. Let me go ahead and put the link to that, that news coverage in the comments here for you guys. Now, I also want to talk briefly, let me go over to my notes, about some federal actions that we have going on. So there's 2 that I'd like to cover. So members of the United States Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs voted on September 27th to advance legislation, the Safer Banking Act, which would allow financial institutions to be able to more readily establish relationships with state licensed cannabis businesses. Although the members of the House have passed an earlier version of the legislation on several prior occasions, the vote marks the first time that Senate members have voted in favor of the measure. Interestingly, according to new data released from the U.S. Department of Treasury, only about 12% of all U.S. banks and 5% of all U.S. credit unions currently provide banking services to marijuana-related businesses. This is extremely important information and an important vote. The legislation will still need to advance through the Senate. So there is an action alert that I'm going to put here in the comments where you can go to support the Safer Banking Act. So definitely encourage you guys to participate in that. Now, the other item that I wanted to talk about was legislation to ease hiring restrictions. So members of the U.S. House of Representatives, their Oversight Accountability Committee, voted 30-14 on September 20th in favor of HR 5040, which is known as the Cannabis Users Restoration of Eligibility, or CURE Act. It expands federal employment and advancement opportunities, there went my light, for those with history of past cannabis use. As amended and passed by the committee, legislation limits federal agencies to be able to consider an applicant's past cannabis use when making security clearance and federal employment decisions. So this CURE Act is advancing forward. And so I'm also going to drop a link to that here in the comments. I mean, I look like I'm getting ready for a scary movie. Isn't that appropriate because it's October? Sorry about that, guys. The light just couldn't keep on going. It is battery operated, so there's that. Okay, let's see. So those are the two federal actions. I also wanted to remind everybody that we rolled out our new shop recently at the Texas NORML website, and I'm going to drop a link to that in there. We also are renewing our efforts to get our volunteer base up and ready to rumble for some events that we have coming up in the next year. So there is a volunteer program that you can participate in. Let's see if I can get that link for you real quick. Get involved. So this tab right here, texasnormal.org/volunteer, is where you can go and sign up to become a volunteer. We will do trainings with you before the events. And the next big event that we are looking forward to doing is, save the date for it, we are going to be doing our annual Puff and Putt, which is a both disc golf and ball golf tournament. I mean, ball golf is probably not how people like to describe it, but that's how I'm going to describe it, benefiting Texas NORML and our efforts. And it is held out at Willie Nelson's golf course. So definitely, if you want to volunteer for that event, you would need to sign up now so that you could go through the training needed to volunteer at that event. Of course, there are volunteer benefits, etc. So I definitely encourage y'all to do that. That's cute. Someone in the comment says, I heard the call was coming from within the house. Ooh. All right, guys. Well, I don't see any questions in there, but that was the overview on what's going on with the Delta 8 ruling, what's happening concerning some raids in some of the cities, as well as prosecutorial discretion, talks about a special session to deal with medical cannabis and Delta 8, as well as two federal bills, both the SAFE and the CURE Act, which are moving through our Congress up in DC. So on that note, I will wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next month on the first Wednesday of the month.